Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is Graph Stuff FM, our very first live episode. So a little bit quickly for those of you who are wondering, what's Graph Stuff? So this is a new podcast that we've put together, and we're mainly going to be talking about graphs from a developer's perspective. So we are going to be your co-hosts, Lju and Will Lyon. Start again. So we're going to be your co-hosts, Lju Lazarevic and Will Lyon. And just very quickly, for those of you who are wondering, this is not a replacement for the podcast that Rick van Bruggen does. So this is very much us looking at more of the developer point of view with regards to things around graphs and what they're encountering around that. So the kinds of things we'll cover in this series will be graph native under the bonnet, for example. So how exactly does Neo4j work? Thinking processes around graph modeling. So what kind of decisions will you go through? What considerations? What about the Neo4j platform universe, all the various bits and pieces in there? What do they mean? How do they work together? And so forth. And this is going to be something we are going to be doing on a regular basis. And if you would like to be notified as episodes come through, do check out Graph FM. Also, do check out graphstuff.fm and you will be able to follow us in your favorite podcast provider. So the main driver behind today's episode is all about how do you get started when you put together a presentation. So what is the whole journey behind that? And a lot of this is being driven by our upcoming conference, Nodes. So I'm going to hand over to Will, who's going to tell us a bit about Nodes.
Yeah, so Nodes is the Neo4j Online Developer Expo and Summit. This is coming up on, I think, the third edition of this. This is basically Neo4j Online Developer Conference. The date of Nodes is June, I think, 17th is when it will be live for everyone to join around the world. But the call for proposals has been live for a few weeks now, and the deadline is April 5th for the call for proposals. So if you're interested in sharing your graph story with the world, definitely please consider submitting a conference proposal. And we'll talk a bit about sort of how do you structure that conference proposal, what sort of motivates you for thinking about putting a talk together? How do you come up with ideas? So we'll go through all of this to give you ideas of sort of how to structure your proposal. But then also what we want to talk about today is, okay, you've submitted your proposal, it's been accepted, and you now have, a month, 2 months, a couple of weeks, whatever, to think about putting your talk together. How do you approach that? What are some things that Lju and I have learned? Hopefully some of this will be useful for you. So if you're interested in learning more about Nodes or submitting your proposal, go to neo4j.com/nodes. We'll take you there. We'll also link in the show notes the link to the call for proposals and all of that. Cool. So let's get into it. Maybe to kind of kick off the discussion, Lju, I thought a fun question to start with might be, do you remember your first conference talk?
Oh my goodness, yes. So this was quite a while back in a different lifetime, and it was a scientific conference, an academic conference that I was presenting at, and it was all about detecting birds through wing oscillations. So the idea that you could try and identify different bird species effectively based on how they flap their wings. And it was quite interesting because there's lots of people there. And it was a bit of a daunting one as well. So the first time I did this, it was a bit daunting. Because I get a bit nervous. I've had practice now, but I got a bit nervous. I was in front of a large group of people. I was talking about a subject where some bits I was quite familiar, but other bits I was like, whoa, there is so much about this that I don't know. And always had a bit at the back of my mind going, oh my goodness, what happens if somebody asks me a question that I can't answer? So it was an interesting experience. It was a fun experience, but yes, I remember it well. What about yourself?
Yeah, so for me, the first sort of conference talk, and the meetups sort of blur together, and I'm not sure exactly which was first. I've gave some talks at some of the local meetups, and there's like a local community conference as well that I've spoken at for a few years, and I can't remember exactly in what order, but for me, in sort of when I think of my exposure to public speaking more broadly, the the thing that was much more impactful for me was I spent a year teaching introduction to computer science at my university when I was working on my master's degree. I had a teaching scholarship, or whatever you call that, and this, I think, was really quite a challenge for me to sort of give a lecture, 3 times a week about, intro to computer science. And it was a pretty large class. So it was very intimidating for me initially. And I remember just being like very uh, overwhelmed initially, and very scared. It was in the forestry building, which was like across campus from the computer science building. I think we didn't have a room big enough or something. And just going over into the forestry building was intimidating for me at the time. So anyway, this was, I think, like a really good experience for me, and this really informed how I think about things like connecting with the audience, and making sure that I'm engaging with my students, and a lot of these things were really sort of formative for how I think about public speaking. So anyway, so thinking about, yeah, sort of first public speaking exposure, that's kind of what I think about.
Absolutely. And it's a great experience. It can definitely be scary to begin with, but it's a fantastic experience. And what would be really good now is to talk about, why would you sign up for this? We talked about being a bit nervous or a bit frightened or worried what people are going to ask us, a huge audience. Why would you step forward and do a conference talk?
I think there's a lot of reasons, right? I think that especially for developers, you see a lot of these very technical conferences out there, and people sharing knowledge, sharing what they've learned, helping others build new skills. And I think it's seen almost as sort of a step in like a career development phase, right? Like being able to present technical material to your peers, sort of sharing something that you've learned. So I think you can really benefit from a professional perspective by sort of being able to hone and exercise that sort of professional technical communication, right? Because I think this is an important skill to have just day to day, right? Is being able to communicate about technical topics with your peers. So I think that can be a big motivator. I think for me, really, the biggest motivation is sort of the learning process that they say that you really haven't learned something until you can teach it to others, and I found that this is really, really true. Like if you really want to learn something yourself, try to teach it to someone else, and giving a conference talk like really gives you the opportunity to sort of go through that exercise. So for me, almost that's like the number one sort of motivation.
Absolutely. I think another element as well is personal development. So you've touched on that with the idea of, how do you reinforce that you've really learned the subject and understand it. But there's another element as well, I think, when you present, which is, if you do have a phobia of meeting new people, or what happens if you're a group of people that you're unfamiliar with, or you have an idea or an opinion and you feel a bit nervous about sharing it. This is a really great way to be really structured about how you approach that, and getting that exposure. It's a really great way to just keep doing it over and over, and it gets easier over time. And that also fits in with the career development and being more at ease at being able to present your ideas and thoughts to an audience. And it works on the personal level as well as the career level, as well as being able to reinforce that learning. And I think that's really important. And another element as well, I think it's really important to promote your brand. So especially now as we're ever more connected, and it's not just here's my CV and this is what I've done. I think it can be very important as well to demonstrate your thought leadership, where your skills are, and being able to be confident in a presentation format to be able to do that really helps define your brand and who you are. And if you don't want to do it for yourself, again, it's something really useful to define the brand of your company, or if you're working on a project within your company, being able to maximize the awareness of what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you're doing it. So I think there's many reasons as to the benefits of why you should go and do a conference talk. So I guess another element that might come up where some people go, okay, you've sold it to me. I get the value of doing a presentation, but you know what? I'm absolutely terrified. And I'm terrified because I get nervous of presenting to people. I don't know how to come up with ideas for a conference. What if I don't absolutely know my subject inside out? Or the terror, the fear of fears. What happens if somebody asks me a question that I can't answer there and then? So what kind of approaches have you come across? Do you use? You've got experience in to manage these kinds of terror points?
Yeah, that's really common, right? I think there's a saying that, more people are afraid of public speaking than they are of dying or something like that. I have no idea if that's true or not, but it's certainly something that is scary the first few times you do it, right? And I think it's fundamentally it's something that from my perspective anyway, I just kind of had to practice doing. And once you've done it a few times, then a lot of that sort of nervousness and terror goes away. At least I've found. And for me, going back to teaching a class, the first few lectures I gave, I was very nervous and like, yeah, like terrified to get started. And I found, that, okay, giving a lecture to a group of 60 or 70 students 3 times a week, like once you've done that a few times, then it starts to sort of smooth out and get easier, and you sort of enjoy a lot of the feedback that you're getting, and engaging with your audience is like a really rewarding experience. And so once I had done that a few times, I would just think, well, okay, I've done this before. Like, this is nothing that I should be sort of nervous and terrified about. So I think it's something. Think of it as sort of an achievement to overcome, and just sort of some practice to get in. And once I think you've start to experience the benefits of seeing folks that are engaged, and seeing some of that feedback is really really reinforcing, and I think can be a big help.
Absolutely. And I think the important thing there as well is just keep doing it. The more times you do it, the easier it gets, the more comfortable you will be, the more confident you will be. It's with many things in life, the more times you do it, the easier it gets. And whilst you don't have that experience yet, whilst you're quite new, practice, practice, practice. I think I read somewhere you get some seasoned keynote speakers will spend something like 3-4 times the amount of time that they will be delivering their speech to how much time they spend practicing it. So if your keynote is 20 minutes, you could easily be spending up to 2 hours plus the number of multiple times you are practicing it over and over again till you're comfortable. So that is a key thing to do, so that you know your content inside out. So it's not a surprise when you're delivering it. So that's one thing that you're certain about in your environment. And the other thing as well, it's your story. So even if you're nervous and you're starting, it's your story. You came up with it, you know it well, and just tell it, and you'll find that you'll start to settle into a groove. And then you may even, shock horror, even be enjoying the process because people are there to hear your story. So yeah, many things you can do to counteract that. I guess another biggie one around that is, what do you do if you're asked an awkward question?
Yeah, so there's sort of the questions that you have no idea how to answer, right? There's the questions where I have mixed feelings about conference Q&A, I guess, but that's maybe another discussion. I think some people like to hear themselves talk, right? And a lot of questions are actually comments and maybe feedback. So I think for those kinds of questions where someone is, maybe making a comment or a statement that, is rather them trying to share something rather than digging deeper into a subject, I like to sort of reinterpret their question and comment as sort of the question that I would like to answer that's somewhat related to what they're discussing, right? And there's lots of examples of this, but I think it's really important to remember that during the conference presentation and even the Q&A, that you're speaking to the larger audience, right? You're not sort of, it's not beneficial for the larger audience necessarily to go on some tangent that you maybe don't know anything about, or something that's maybe only relevant for the person asking the question. So I think as you're thinking of how to answer these things, try to think of that context. Like, if it's something that you don't know anything about, like, I think maybe the audience doesn't either, right? And they lack that context. So I think taking a step back and maybe saying, okay, well, at a higher level, here's sort of the context around the question that you're asking. And I don't really know anything about the specific thing that you're asking about, but here's how I understand that it fits into the larger context, and sort of lay things out that way, I think is actually like really appreciated for others in the audience watching who maybe don't really understand, maybe the specific thing that the person is asking about. So sort of rephrasing, taking a step back, setting some context, I think can be a helpful way to just sort of rephrase and think about things. But also fundamentally, if someone asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, like, it's perfectly reasonable to say, I don't know the answer to that. Like, let's move on to something else. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I've done that. I've seen people do that, and that it's, from the audience perspective, it's more helpful for them to have you identify something and say, hey, that's not something I'm an expert on. Like, let's move on to something else, rather than to kind of waste their time trying to, I don't know, trying to make something up. So perfectly fine to say, I don't know. Let's move on to something else.
And it's also perfectly fine to say, let's exchange details. I can come back to you on that. So if that's something you want to explore, you don't know the answer, but you can look that up, you know how to look that up, then again, that's perfectly fine. And touching on something as well you said there about the audience, it does happen where somebody asks you a question, you don't know it, but sometimes it's okay to ask the audience because there may be somebody there who can answer that question. So you've got so many options there. You can engage the audience. And again, if you have that person who asks that awkward question, you have the option as well to turn it back to them and say, well, what are your thoughts on this? If it's something, if they're somebody who's trying to give their view. So you have a number of ways to answer it. But if you're thinking, oh, this is too hard, again, it's perfectly okay to just say, I'm not too sure, I can get back to you on that, as the easy opt-out options. You've got many different ways to tackle that fun topic. Okay, so hopefully we've put you all at ease when it comes to thinking about why you should do a presentation and how would you tackle some of those awkward situations if you're a bit new to presenting. So the next one is coming up with that killer idea that you're going to do a presentation on. So how do you approach this normally?
Yeah, I think there's a few sort of fundamental ways to come up with ideas for conference talks. I think there's sort of, looking at some of the interesting problems you've solved, some of the challenges that you've overcome recently, like wanting to share some of that, I think is a great source of inspiration for conference talks. Because if it's something that you've learned, something that you've struggled with, some challenge that you've overcome, some application that you've built, some design pattern that you've learned, um, that's evidence there that it's something that will be of interest to a larger group, right? So I think that is a really great sort of area. There's also sort of the area of I sort of know something about this. I'd like to learn a little bit more. Why don't I just sort of challenge myself to learn enough about this to be able to give a conference talk about it, right? This is sort of goes back to a point we made earlier about being able to teach something to someone else as sort of the ultimate form of learning it yourself. So I kind of like to joke of this idea of conference-driven development, that, okay, once you sort of have committed to giving a conference talk about this, you sort of have this forcing function now of like making sure that you actually can, build this thing and give a presentation about the topic. I think that there's a fine line here, though, between sort of choosing something that you're not really not really is realistic to dig into and go into the depth of building a conference talk around it, versus something that you have some tangential familiarity with, and it's something of interest for you, right? So there's sort of a fine line there, but I think that can be, just sort of having that conference talk, if it's something that aligns with your professional goals, right? Maybe you have an OKR with your team, so a goal of something that you need to build, something that you need to dig into anyway from a technical perspective. If this aligns with that, then that can be a great motivator for you to sort of dig into that topic in a lot more depth.
Absolutely. And the other one can be, you see a common problem coming up over and over again. So let's say you're active in a community and you keep seeing the same question come up over and over again. And you go, you know what? I think there's a gap here. Maybe this is something I can put together an educational talk. So you want to get your community friends have that understanding about how to come over that. So that's another great way you can come up with some ideas for a talk. Another option too is have a look at past talks. And this doesn't have to be necessarily around Neo4j. This can be any technical talk or any non-technical talk. Is there something that inspires you? Is there a speaker that inspires you? What is it that inspires you? Is it because they're solving a problem? Is it because there's a specific call to action that they make? Is there something there that helps trigger some thinking around what you can do as a result? So is there something you can follow their style, or you follow the way that they discover a problem and how they solve it? So that's potentially another way of finding some ideas for inspiration.
Cool. So let's talk a bit about the process of submitting a proposal. So most conferences have what's called a CFP, or call for proposals or call for papers. And this is basically, the conference putting out this open call for submissions, for proposals, for conference talks and speakers. And every conference does it a little bit differently, but I think there's a sort of a common structure and a common theme to the CFP. So let's maybe spend a few minutes talking about, how do we write a good proposal? What are the basic components of the proposal? How do we make it compelling? Because I think this is kind of the first step, really, of sort of going down that path of giving a conference presentation, of making sure that it's compelling for the organizers of the conference to say, hey, this looks really good, let's accept this and put it in the agenda. Because I know conferences get a lot of proposals, and a lot of times it can be difficult to sort of sort through the proposals and identify the talks that are really going to stand out and that the organizers want to have in their conference. So I think it is important to make sure that your proposal really does stand out and makes it clear like who you are, what you're going to talk about, and make it clear that this can be a compelling talk for the audience. So those are the things that I think the organizers are thinking about as they're going through the CFP. So let's talk at maybe just a high level, like what are the individual components of a proposal, and then maybe talk about sort of how to structure each one of those to make it sort of compelling and stand out. So the basic components of every CFP is a title for your conference talk, and then a description, an abstract. So the difference between a description and an abstract, and each conference does this a little bit differently, but typically the title, this is like a one-liner, um, overview of Cipher query language, right? Something like that. A description is something that typically that the conference will put on the website or in the schedule. So this is like a couple of sentences, something like, in this talk, we take a look at the Cipher query language and how to use it for writing basic queries, something like that. Then the abstract is typically a bit more detailed, and sometimes this the abstract is not shared publicly. A lot of times this is just for you to share to the conference organizers. Here's how I'm going to structure the talk. Here are sort of the main bullet points, going into a lot more detail than what the description does. So that's sort of how I think about it. And again, this can be a bit different, but I sort of write the description for the prospective attendee who's sort of trying to see, is this a talk I'm interested in going to? I write the abstract sort of almost as like an outline of what the talk will be. And then the fourth component of a proposal is your bio. So who are you? What experience do you have? What's your job? Why are you sort of qualified to give this talk? So those are the basic components. I think then it's important also to think about how to make each of these compelling, and sort of how do you structure these. So do you have any thoughts on that, Leo, of sort of how to make your CFP compelling?
I think the easiest way to make it compelling is to be really clear in your mind who your audience is. So who do you want to come to your talk? And be very clear about what do you want your audience to go away with. So do you want them to be enlightened? Do you want them to be going away thinking about something that's triggered a thought function that they've not considered before? Do you have a call to action? So what exactly do you want your audience to go away with? So who's your audience? What do you want them to go away with? What would good look like? And I think that goes a long way towards driving what your title is going to look like, because if the title doesn't give a good view of what your audience is going to go away with, then you keep iterating until it does. Same idea with the description in the abstract. So does it give you a clear view when you look through that, what kind of audience you want and what you want them to go away with? So I think just having those two questions and you keep cycling through and you just keep checking, I think will get you a long way there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you nailed it spot on there. So let's say that your proposal has been accepted. The organizers have said, yes, this sounds like a great talk. We want you to come speak at our conference, either online or in person. Now we need to think about actually building the talk, right? And hopefully we have some time ahead of us to prepare. We don't need to sort of rush this. I'd say this is probably an important thing to note is the more time that you can sort of take to start building out the talk, I think the less stressed you will feel, and ultimately the higher quality the talk can be. So if you have a couple of months, if you have a month, if you have a few weeks, like whenever you sort of have gotten that acceptance from the conference organizers, yes, we'd like you to come speak. I would say start building your talk then, or you can even start before that if it's something that you're truly passionate about. But anyway, let's talk a bit about that process of sort of how do we build the talk, and I think building the talk is a good way to think of it, because there are several important components to the talk, right? It's not just sort of the presentation itself, it's sort of the assets around that, right? Are you building a demo? Are you creating slides? What is sort of the delivery mechanism that you're going to have? Are you having like visuals and diagrams? Is there a GitHub repo that you're sharing along with this? So there's a lot of things to think about. Just sort of to kick off the discussion here of building the talk, in my view, I think that the narrative or the story is actually the most important fundamental part of the talk, and everything in my mind is sort of secondary from that. So like, sure, of course it needs to be technically accurate, having a working demo, having nice diagrams and visuals, those are all important, but fundamentally you're telling a story here, and figuring out what that narrative is, for me, is my sort of fundamental starting point. So what I like to do is I think there's a very important sort of creative exercise and sort of creative connection between sort of visual thinking and sort of the tactileness of like drawing something out, almost like mind mapping. And so for me to sort of figure out what the narrative is, I do a couple of different things. One is I sort of start with a few bullet points of what are the key takeaways. So like Lou was saying, when you're writing that proposal, think of, okay, who the audience is, what are the key takeaways for them going to be, and sort of write that out. And that sort of forms the fundamental sort of heart of the narrative. And then I like to go to a whiteboard or on paper, and then just sort of diagram out sort of the different components, the different sort of pieces of the talk that I want to share, right? And sort of what sort of sets the context. So for me, it's a very creative process to find that sort of core narrative, and that really drives a lot of my process. But how about you, Lou? Where do you sort of start with the building of the talk process?
Story. There always has to be a story. And in my mind, there's a number of reasons for this. I think a story helps your audience because there is a journey here, there is a lesson to be learned. And you think across history, stories are the best delivery mechanism for that. How do you deliver a learning through a story? Another really big reason for it is it really helps you to think about how you're going to put together a presentation. So a story innately gives you structure to work around that. So yeah, why I start with the story. Then the next thing I will, sorry.
I just thought maybe it might be helpful to share an example of what we mean by a story and narrative to kind of put some context around this. So I'll share an example from a talk that I worked on recently for the CityJS conference, and the title of the talk was a graph data love story, and the sort of the narrative is, okay, there are these two technologies that sort of come from fundamentally different worlds. So this was a talk about GraphQL and Neo4j and how to use them together, and the benefits you get from using them together. And so the story is sort of, okay, these two technologies, okay, one is sort of loved by front end developers, GraphQL. Another is a database that is serving a very different need. But when we sort of take these two technologies together, they each have something to offer the other. In the terms of applying a type safe schema to the database, and from Neo4j being sort of optimized for the type of nested queries that you often have in GraphQL, right? So sort of telling the story of how these two technologies, what they are independently, but then when we use them together, here's sort of the benefits that we get. And that's maybe not a super complex story, but that's like the fundamental narrative that flows through the talk. So when we're talking about sort of a story and narrative, that's the sort of thing that we mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think certainly from a tech talk perspective, the story structures tend to be quite similar. So I'll pick the example I used for my notes presentation last year. And again, sort of similar process was I tell the story, and my story was I was exploring a data set. So this was the wine data set for those of you who are familiar. And then we talk about the next point of the story, which is a pain. I came across a pain. My pain was, how do I deal with dirty data? And then we continued this story of going, well, okay, so I've carried on my journey. My pain is this dirty data. We then continued the story where we talk about the options we explored and how can we solve this. And then the story has a happy ending, which is we've successfully cleaned it using these methodologies. And if anybody else finds themselves in this similar predicament, they can use the fables, the lessons from this fable to apply to their problem. So it doesn't have to be a big intricate story, but there is a story there to drive it. And the nice thing about having a story is it's so much easier to deliver. You don't have to memorize what you put on some slides. You can have image slides. You can have diagrams with no words on there. Because you know that story, you can talk to your story, but it's difficult to talk to a slide of facts, for example. So it helps engage your audience. It keeps it interesting. It makes the process of making the presentation interesting, and it makes it so much easier to deliver. It's win-win-win everywhere. So I guess the next bit from here is, how do you tighten up that story? So we've talked about generating the ideas. We've talked about having a story to help drive that. How do you work through the approach of getting it a bit more polished up and making the story tight?
Yeah, so for me, I think a large part of that, of developing the story, is this sort of visual thinking exercise, right? So I go to the whiteboard, or lately I've been using a drawing app on my iPad for this, and almost just sort of like drawing a mind map diagram of sort of, okay, what are the key points? So I have my sort of takeaways as sort of the center, right? So I have like my three to four bullet points of like the takeaway for the audience, and we'll talk about the audience in a second, because that's another like really important component. But I've sort of decided on here's sort of what I want the audience to get out of that, and that's sort of the core piece of this sort of this visual thinking diagram exercise. And then I sort of end up drawing sort of, it's almost like a graph, right? Sort of like nodes that are the sort of parts of the narrative that I want to convey. So in my sort of Neo4j and GraphQL graph data love story talk, right? Like the key components of the narrative are, I want you to understand the benefits that you get from using these two technologies together. And I have 3 or 4 examples. And then I expand on that a bit more in this sort of diagram, and sort of see how those pieces fit together. Then I start to think of, okay, well, how is it sort of best to convey this point to the audience? Should I do this in a code example? Should I do this as a diagram? Should I do this as a demo? And I think it really depends on what it is, but I think you can clearly start to see where one of those formats is better than the other. I think diagrams and visuals can be, I think, a really important piece of building the talk, because that's the visual aid for your audience, right? Like you, as Lou said, you know how to sort of tell this story verbally, and having some visual cue to show how the pieces fit together while you're talking about this can be a very helpful visual aid for your audience. And everyone learns in a different style, right? Like some of us learn best from visuals, some of us learn better from sort of hearing something explained to us, some of us are more experiential. So I think it's more important to sort of address those different aspects throughout your talk. So you want to have like the compelling story and narrative, you want to have some visuals and diagrams that explain how the pieces fit together. And then I think it's also useful to have code examples and demos where appropriate that are going to be more compelling for the experiential learners to sort of take away from that, where they sort of need to see this more concrete example. And ideally, if there's a GitHub repo or somewhere that those folks can then go pull down and play around with to actually like really cement those. So I think that's an important thing just to remember. And again, this maybe goes back to the concept of empathizing with the audience a bit, to really recognize that folks learn in lots of different ways, and try to incorporate those different elements into your presentation that will address the different ways that different people learn from those different styles.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the audience. So how do you target your presentation to your audience? What are you looking for? What approach do you use?
Yeah, that's a good one. And we had a question on Twitter from Nathan Smith here. How do I judge the technical level of the audience of my topic, right? Which I think is really important. And that, I think, is sort of a fundamental thing to think about up front as you're structuring your talk. Sort of what do I expect my audience to know? Sort of who is my audience? Who am I speaking to? I have kind of a default persona almost that I think of when I structure my talks, and that persona is me immediately before I didn't know the thing that I'm talking about, right? And so looking at my background, like I've worked as a software developer for a few startups, sort of like full stack sort of thing. So like not too deep in any one area, but more sort of experience with breadth and how the pieces fit together. So that's sort of how I think of my audience, and then I sort of refine it from there. But maybe that is helpful as sort of an exercise to think about your audience. But I think also a lot of conferences have more formal ways for attendees to sort of self-select into the talks. So there's often sort of tracks at conferences where it's clear, okay, this is the track for sort of like the high level architect. This is the track for the sort of data scientist. This is the track for the front end developer, right? And if you sort of know ahead of time what these tracks are going to be, and oftentimes this is part of the CFP process where you're specifically indicating what track or like multiple tracks that you think your talk would fit in, that can be really helpful for you as a presenter to understand, okay, well, here's sort of the structure that the conference organizers are setting out. So I sort of know what audience I'm speaking to based on who's going to be interested in that track. And then also a lot of conferences will also have sort of a level. So this is a beginner talk, this is intermediate, this is advanced, and sort of use that to then structure your talk based on the audience that you expect would be interested in that. So to give you an example, I gave a talk at GraphQL Summit last year, no, 2 years ago, and the title was something like GraphQL Resolve Info Deep Dive. And okay, so that you're talking in the title, you're talking about a very like specific piece of GraphQL implementation. You're saying this is a deep dive. Okay, so this is not going to be a beginner's talk for someone who's completely new to GraphQL. So I think I would try to allow your audience to self-select for sort of what group they are. Okay, if we're talking about the GraphQL resolve info object, well, I have to know what GraphQL is. I have to know that this is probably something to do with implementing GraphQL backends. So maybe I'm targeting like backend developers who are at least intermediately familiar with GraphQL. So do anything you can to allow your audience to self-select, and then that can sort of help you to inform the technical level of your audience.
Absolutely. So I think there's two takeaways there. So number one, have a look at what the conference is asking for. So if the conference has made it explicit that it's going to be beginner level content, or if they've made it explicit it is advanced level content, then you've been pre-told what the audience level is. If you've not been given that specific instruction, then you pick your audience. So you decide which audience you want to target, and then you do the material around that. And please help your audience out, as you're talking about there. Make it clear in the title or the description who exactly that talk is for, and then the audience can self-select whether that is the right talk for them or not. So many options there. And we've talked a little bit about the different ways you can use content for your talk. So we talked about the use of visuals, diagrams. People may put in video, sounds, demos are also helpful. So looking at the different ways of engaging with the audience. But the one thing I'll say very quickly about slides is try to be sparing with them. So that's the one thing I'll say. And I have noticed you get a lot of conferences where you have a lot of slides, and I came from this old school view that each slide should be a minimum of 2 minutes in length. So I think just a quick comment on that, that less is more. And this is where diagrams are amazing. So if you're looking at a big block of text, and this is where it all comes into the whole idea of the more time you can spend to prepare, the better. And I'm just highlighting this because you do see at some conferences, you get a slide and it's just full of text. And ask yourself, can that be represented as a diagram? Can you bring a theme together? Is that information that you want your audience to sit there and read, or do you give them a picture and provide them with a link? So that's one thing I will mention quickly there, because you do see it a lot, and it's an easy way to lose the attention of your audience if they suddenly are not listening to you anymore because they're quickly reading a slide of text. So that's one thing I quickly wanted to flag. Is there anything that you would suggest as well as sort of things to be aware of when putting together a presentation for an audience?
I think that's a really good observation about the slides. I think of slides as sort of they're providing the basic structure for the talk, right? So I like to have these sort of section subheading slides that are, just now I'm talking about this aspect, right? As making it sort of clear of how to structure the talk. And then in between those, I like diagrams that sort of show how the pieces fit together. Your point of sort of linking to source material to references is really useful. I like to, if there's some blog post or page from documentation that has the information that I'm talking about, rather than sort of duplicating that onto the slide, I will just sort of put a link to that on the slide as well. And I think that that's really important as well, to think about how should the slides be treated after the talk, right? So another question we got from the chat here is, should there be handouts? How pretty do my slides need to be? If I think they're not pretty enough, how can I make them better? So this, I think, is drawing on a couple of points here that are really important. One is, like, yes, think of your slides as handouts that someone can refer to later. So I like to use Google Docs for all of my slides because it's very, very easy to share. So I'll make them public. I'll put a short code bit.ly link at the beginning so that anyone can just go to that link at the beginning, and they have access to the slides with links, and sort of treating it as reference material for them to sort of take away and go home with. But then also, of course, like, you're using your slides during the talk, and you want them to, sure, like look nice. You want them to be functional. I probably tend more to the functional aspect than making sure that they're pretty and visually compelling. Mostly because I don't sort of have a lot of expertise or sort of skills in that area. But I know some folks that will use something like Fiverr. So they'll sort of do an initial pass of maybe a diagram or the slides, and then go on to like Fiverr or Upwork to have someone with more visual skills do like a more in-depth, high quality version of the visuals, or even just sort of touch up the slides in general. That can be one option that I've seen folks do. I think another important aspect when we think of sort of how to structure our talk and sort of what components to include in it is the question of to include a demo or not. So I think that there's lots of different viewpoints here. That there's advantages and disadvantages. I think oftentimes in a technical presentation, that having at least some code samples to sort of put things in a more practical context is useful. Oftentimes, what I find myself doing is building a demo application that is sort of like a reference architecture, reference application for the talk. So a while ago, I think this was at the Kafka Summit talk, Dave Allen and I, who gave a talk there, we built a fraud detection application using Neo4j and Kafka and sort of graph data science and in a Grand Stack application to build sort of the front end dashboard. And so we built this thing, and there are a lot of pieces to it, and it worked, and sort of we used it mostly though as like a reference. Like, here's the GitHub repo for all of the pieces. You can pull it down and see how it works. It's not something that we sort of walked through each component of it live during the talk. We just wanted to show sort of like, here's at a high level how the pieces fit together. If you want more detail, go find the code on GitHub. So I think it's, I don't know, it's kind of a balance there, because you have limited time to present your demo. You want to make sure that you're not wasting time trying to set up configuration. If something breaks, fixing it live. So I think some combination of kind of screenshots and sort of like minimal examples that you want to show, but then also making sure that the code is accessible for folks later on is sort of how I like to approach demos.
Absolutely. And I think another question we've got here, we're starting to work through some of the Twitter questions that have been coming in, is, should I try to be funny?
I have a strict rule that I follow for this one. I think it really depends on your personality. I think that if you are have that personality that is really engaging, and you're comfortable sort of being funny and telling jokes and connecting with your audience, that can be a great way for your audience to engage with you. I don't think I sort of have that personality. I think I typically have kind of a dry sense of humor that can come across as unintended sarcasm and whatnot. So I typically don't try to be funny throughout the talk. I think there's nothing wrong with that though, if that fits your personality. But I would say don't try to force it. So the strict rule that I have is I limit myself to one joke per conference talk. And you may not realize this because maybe the joke is not obvious if you've seen some of my talks, but there's at least one joke somewhere in all of them. And this is sometimes it's like a meme slide or something like that. Because I think that fundamentally, like, your audience is interested in having a good time and connecting with you, and of course, like, humor is a great way to connect with them. I don't think that it sort of makes you less authoritative of a speaker, or anything like that. So yeah, if it fits with your personality, sure, go for it.
Yeah, be yourself. If you're one to be a joker and crack a joke, then be yourself. If that is not your personality, I think you walk in dangerous territory if you try and be an anti-pattern of yourself. So be yourself. It's your story and you're telling it with your true self. So I think we're slowly coming to time. So I think let's talk a little bit about what happens after the presentation. So you've put in a lot of work. So a fair bit of work goes into a call for paper. Significantly more work goes into creating the content. And then a load of work afterwards goes into practicing for the session and getting ready. So you've put this big investment of time into this presentation process. What do you do next?
Yeah, I think that fundamentally think about how you can repurpose the content, right? If the talk was recorded and now a lot of conferences have moved online and the talks are on YouTube, like be sure to share the recording with your network. Certainly find the YouTube channel for the conference and sort of share that with your network. But also think about how you can convert that content to other formats. Could you turn it into a blog post? Could you turn it into a tweet thread? This sort of thing, because that you have made an investment in sort of building this, and I think certainly you want to be able to share it across different formats other than just the audience that will have seen your talk, right? So this I think is really important, not to treat it as just sort of a one-off thing that you've sort of built and thrown away, but really use it as a base to build on top of as well.
And coming to the point you made earlier about some of the reasons why you might go through this process, why are you doing a presentation? If you're using this as an opportunity to learn a new subject, then go share it with the world. You've made that investment, you've done the talk at a conference, and even in the unfortunate event if you don't get accepted, you've still invested a lot of time into this project. So are there meetup groups you can go to? So a lot of meetup groups, depending on your technical area, would love to hear that story. So can you contact meetup groups as well, online, in person when we're allowed to do those as well? You have got many options to share that. And the thing is as well, this is a journey. So maybe if this is a project you're working on, you're going to have new installments. So that becomes now the next stage that you can then go off and do a presentation on. So you've got a lot of opportunities there to keep reusing and repurposing that content. So it's not the case of you do it once and that's it. There is a lot of things you can do with it afterwards as well. So I think sorry.
For sure, I think that we're coming close on time here, but we should make sure that we answer any questions from the chat that we didn't get to. I think I see one here from username Second, asking, how do we prepare for the talk, for the technical part as well? Any recommendations? And how long do we usually take to prepare? I think this is the second part of that is I think really important. I think we touched on hopefully some of the first parts there in your question, but how long do you spend sort of preparing your talk? I think is a really interesting question. Lju, do you have any sort of guidelines there on the time you spend preparing for a talk?
That's a great question. The rule of thumb for me will be that the less familiar I am with the subject, the more time I'm going to be spending preparing for it. So if it's something that I'm really confident I know inside out, if it's a 30-minute talk, I could easily be spending maybe a day or so, 2 days if it's brand new slides for that. And then I could easily be spending maybe a few hours just going over the presentation over and over again, doing any iterations and changes. And that's something that I know really, really well. If it's something I'm less familiar with, so I mentioned earlier about if it's a subject that I'm not familiar with, I will practice the content over and over again so that any curveballs are thrown at me, that's one fewer area of errors to come from. But even if I'm familiar, a lot of time goes in. So easily we're talking brand new slides, 2.5 days at least. What about yourself?
I like to spend a lot of time just thinking, right? So getting back to the concept of the narrative and the story and developing that, I like to spend a lot of time just sort of thinking about it and sort of visualizing this and sort of working through different aspects, almost like I'm imagining what the talk sort of sounds like and what the key points are. So I like to spend a lot of time sort of in the background, I guess, just sort of thinking about this and going through that process, even before I start to prepare anything, either on paper or the slides or the demo. Um, so that process, is sort of going on in the background, ideally for maybe a couple of weeks as I'm sort of thinking about this in the background. But then when it comes time to actually sort of prepare and sort of build the materials, it really varies. It's so hard to say if it's something where I've already built like an application or something and I want to pull out some of the interesting aspects from the project I worked on. That's a lot less time because I have a lot of sort of the source technical materials to build from there. Um, in terms of sort of how to build up like the confidence in and sort of not be overwhelmed with not having enough to talk about or not feeling completely confident there. I kind of like to build lots of different demos and like technical things that I often don't end up having time to present during the presentation, but having just sort of having those there in the slides as a reference or a pointer to say, okay, so we didn't get to talk about this, but for more info, here's an example application on GitHub. Here's a demo of this aspect. So in terms of sort of helping to prepare for the technical parts and building up the confidence that you have sort of enough material to talk about, I sort of over index on having that technical content there and oftentimes end up not even using it. But I think it's useful to have sort of as a follow-up for your audience to dig into more after the fact. And then also that then gives me a lot to sort of repurpose for content for blogs and tutorials and whatnot. So anyway, that's sort of how I think about it.
Absolutely. And I think before we leave it there, I'm going to raise one of the comments that have been said by Zafis, which is a friendly reminder to look at the cameras. Absolutely. So we have been a little bit naughty during this session where we've probably been looking at our notes, but absolutely, when you are delivering a presentation, either online, make sure you're looking at the camera as much as possible, and in person, try and connect with the audience. So keep scanning and looking at eyes. So that is absolutely a very good point. Well made and taken on board.
Yeah, and I think that's that's important to remember as well. Like no one is really an expert on giving these kinds of presentations, right? So we're just trying to share what we think has been helpful. Hopefully talking through this was sort of helpful, but take everything that we say with a grain of salt, right? Because these are things from our experience that work, but not necessarily will work for you, and not pretending to be experts in this domain.
Absolutely. So I think with that, we're going to call it a wrap. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So as a quick reminder, we are live now, but this will be available as a recording later. So you can find this along with following episodes of our podcast on graphstuff.fm. And without further ado, thank you very much for joining us.
Cheers, folks.
Bye.